There comes a point where the constant disappointment from a franchise you love stops making you angry and you just become numb to it. After walking away from the Resident Evil 6 demo and watching the series completely lose its identity to chase Hollywood action trends, I was more or less broken off from the franchise entirely. The trust was gone. I had the classic entries and I could run, rerun and speedrun them all I wanted, but as far as the modern era was concerned, I was ready to move on. I didn't stop gaming, I just went looking for substance elsewhere. This was the exact era where my time started being completely absorbed by the Dark Souls series. I ended up sinking hundreds of hours into those games, and it didn't take long to realise they were giving me the exact experience Capcom had abandoned. Dark Souls had the thick, oppressive atmosphere I was starving for. It had a deliberate mechanical strategy that forced you to respect the space you were in, learn the environments, and weigh the risk of every single encounter. It treated you with maturity, punishing your mistakes instead of giving you a flashy, high-octane get-out-of-jail-free card. Dumb, mindless action set pieces were never really going to grip me for long, and watching Resident Evil trying to turn itself into a second-rate military shooter just felt hollow by comparison. Because I had completely checked out, Resident Evil Revelations 2 didn't even register on my radar when it launched in 2015. I didn't care about the episodic release gimmick, I didn't care about the promotional trailers, and I certainly wasn't going to rush out to buy it. I completely overlooked it, leaving it behind as a relic of a franchise I used to love. It wasn't until just a few years ago that I finally decided to sit down and give it a proper fair chance. And while it's certainly not a disaster, finally playing through it only confirmed why I drifted away in the first place.
Some kind of monsters have killed the others. Please, send help! Oh God. What is this place?
Welcome back to the archive. This is the retrospective journey where we are tracking the evolution of survival horror from its pixelated foundations to the modern era, examining how a single franchise can completely lose its way and desperately try to find its footing again. When Resident Evil Revelations 2 arrived in the early months of 2015, Capcom was in a bizarre position. The commercial success of Resident Evil 6 had been offset by a massive wave of critical backlash from the core community, leaving the studio terrified of going too big, but equally terrified of going back to the niche, slow burn pacing of the 90s. Their solution was an experimental, mid-budget project released as a weekly episodic series, a fragmented delivery system that felt more like a television drama than a traditional survival horror game. On paper, the narrative hook for this experiment was an absolute masterstroke for the old school crowd. They were finally given the legendary Barry Burton his first starring role in a mainline capacity since the original 1996 disaster in the Arklay Mountains. It was a nostalgic lineup specifically engineered to drag the lapsed fans like me back into the fold. Yet, when I finally sat down to play through the complete package properly just a few years ago, that initial wave of nostalgia quickly ran into a very loud, middle-of-the-road reality. I see a massive amount of praise for this game online. Within the bubble of the community, Revelations 2 is often treated as an underrated hidden gem that saved the franchise from action-heavy doldrums. But sitting down with it with a lifetime of survival horror context, the truth is a lot more complicated. It's not a disaster, but it's very much mid. It stands as a fascinating, awkward artifact of a time when Resident Evil still didn't actually know what it wanted to be, caught entirely between the shadow of its past and the corporate trends of its present.
field. You're coming with us.
No, there must be some kind of...
When you take a step back and look at the design philosophy holding Revelations 2 together, you realise it is the absolute definition of the middle-of-the-road experience. It doesn't have the catastrophic, unplayable roughness of a spin-off failure, but it completely lacks the confidence and the artistic vision of a masterpiece. It is trapped in a very specific, mid-budget purgatory, a game that is perfectly functional, entirely playable, and thoroughly average from top to bottom. The core issue is that this entry represents a franchise caught in a classic corporate identity crisis. Capcom knew they had to dial back the exhausting military spectacle of Resident Evil 6, but they still weren't brave enough to completely commit to a pure, isolated horror experience. So they tried to split the difference. They built a system that desperately chased the mid-2010s gaming trends, specifically the industry's obsession with the cooperative partner mechanics and the repetitive crafting systems, while simultaneously throwing a bone to old-school purists by turning down the lights and slowing down the movement. The result is a game that constantly trips over its own feet because it's trying to please everyone at once. You can feel the design teams pulling the mechanics in two entirely opposite directions. One minute the game wants you to sneak through the shadows and conserve your ammunition like it's 1998, and the next minute it drops you into a frantic, wave-based combat arena where you're slapping upgrade parts into a workbench to increase your damage output. It's an approach that ensures Revelations 2 is only ever okay at either side of the coin. The horror elements never feel genuinely terrifying because you always have a dedicated, fully voiced companion by your side to break the isolation, and the action elements never feel truly satisfying because the budget restrictions mean the gunplay lacks the raw, explosive polish of a mainline blockbuster. It's still not the direction I've ever wanted my childhood franchise to go. It proved that simply throwing iconic characters into a darker room wasn't enough. The series still didn't have a clear soul, leaving it wandering in a grey zone where compromise took precedence over genuine terror.
My life is awesome! That bitch stuck a needle in me?
Claire, get up to the roof!
See? We're like sisters. Claire, we lost the girl.
Moira was trying to get to that tower when I was with her. Barry, there's something right there.
I've been waiting for you.
Wait. Well, that's one hell of a parking job.
Me and Moira got separated here. The nice guy came and got me.
Two Westers.
The episodic structure splits the narrative right down the middle, and it kicks off with Claire Redfield's campaign. Watching her step back into a primary role should have been a monumental moment, but the setup immediately drags the pacing down into that familiar mid-2010s trend territory. Claire, now working for the biohazard prevention agency TerraSave, is abducted alongside a new recruit who just happens to be Barry's estranged daughter, Maura Burton. They wake up trapped inside a derelict, Kafka-infused prison facility on a desolate island surrounded by twisted, groaning experiments known as the Afflicted. Now Claire is an absolute star of this franchise, and her presence alone brings a sense of grit and legacy that the series desperately needed. But the mechanical execution of her chapters immediately highlights Capcom's total reliance on co-op gimmicks. Because the game is built entirely around cooperative play, Claire is given the firearms, while Maura is strictly relegated to a support role. Maura refuses to use guns due to a childhood trauma, meaning her gameplay loop consists of blinding enemies with a flashlight, crowbarring open locked doors, and highlighting hidden items on the floor. This companion dynamic completely shatters any lingering illusion of survival horror. True tension relies on isolation and vulnerability. The moment you are constantly swapping characters to shine a light on a shelf, or use a partner as a human distraction to line up a shotgun blast, the fear evaporates. Instead of carefully navigating a terrifying claustrophobic space, you are managing an isometrical puzzle combat team. It is perfectly functional, and the dynamic between the two leads is decent, but it always feels like the design is pulling focus away from pure, unadulterated survival. It's a compromise that keeps Claire's chapters hovering in that safe, thoroughly average zone, never bad enough to make you turn it off, but never tense enough to make you hold your breath.
You better hope someone saves you!
Don't interfere.
The second half of each episode flips the timeline forward 6 months, bringing us to the portion of the game that most fans point to when they defend this title. We finally get the return of Barry Burton, arriving on the island alone in a heavily armed tactical vest, desperately tracking down his daughter's last known radio signal. But before he even takes 20 steps onto the dock, the isolation is immediately broken as he runs into Natalia Corda, a strange, quiet little girl who possesses a supernatural ability to sense bioweapons through walls. Having Barry back as a major playable capacity after nearly 2 decades in the narrative wilderness is an absolute treat. He brings a grounded, exhausted weight to the screen that fits the isolated setting perfectly, and his interactions with Natalia give the story an emotional spine that Claire's campaign lacks. But mechanically, we are right back into the exact same cooperative trap. While Barry handles the heavy assault rifles and magnums, the gameplay loop constantly forces you to swap over to Natalia. Because she can see the glowing red auras of enemies through solid infrastructure, you are forced to use her to map out stealth routes, crawl through small vents, and spot the entirely invisible glaze of bugs that can instantly kill Barry if you get too close. It's a system that is entirely functional, and it certainly creates a few decent moments of tactical tension, but it also highlights a franchise that was still completely terrified of letting the player just be alone in the dark. Instead of building atmospheric dread through environmental design and sound engineering, Capcom substituted horror for an artificial wall hack mechanic. It's an enjoyable enough loop to blast through on a quiet evening, but it constantly reminds you that the game is more interested in managing companion gimmicks than delivering an authentic, resource-scarce survival horror experience.
Look out! This one's different! I can see that!
Once you look past the character combinations and step into the actual world Capcom built, the mid-budget reality of Revelations 2 hits you like a cold slap in the face. This was never a flagship project, and it is painfully obvious that the production value took a massive, unceremonious step down compared to the multi-million-dollar global spectacles of Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. The entire experience is wrapped in a visual coating that can only be described as completely uninspired. The environments you spend your time trekking through are a relentless parade of mid-2010s gaming cliches. You start in a drab grey prison facility, transition into an overgrown brown forest, wade through generic sewer systems, and inevitably finish the journey by digging through an abandoned mining complex. It is a checklist of the most cost-effective, easy-to-render asset kits available at the time. Now, some corners of the community have argued that this bleak, washed-out palette was an intentional artistic choice designed to create a heavy, Eastern European atmospheric dread, but in physical execution, it doesn't feel atmospheric at all, it just feels cheap. The textures are frequently muddy, the lighting is flat, and the level design relies heavily on recycled corridors and empty blocky rooms that lack any real sense of architectural history. This is where the game's structural identity truly struggles to hold its own against the legacy of the franchise. Classic Resident Evil succeeded because its locations were characters in their own right. Places like the Spencer Mansion, the Raccoon City Police Department, or even the Gothic villages of Spain had a distinct, unforgettable personality. You learned their layouts because the spaces were memorable and intricately crafted. Revelations 2, by comparison, feels like it's taken place in a series of generic, interchangeable backdrops. It captures a baseline level of grim desolation, sure, but it completely lacks the creative spark and artistic ambition required to make the island feel like a place worth exploring, leaving the technical side of the package feeling just as middle of the road as the mechanics themselves.
Terror. The world lives with it. You live with it. Viruses are stolen, re-engineered, misused with tragic results. And who are you supposed to trust? Politicians who sell their souls for a few votes? CEOs who betray consumers for a quick buck? Count on us instead. We're above the politics, always watching, always ready to face the threat head on.
While the primary campaign struggled under the weight of its own compromises, the absolute peak of Revelations 2's structural identity is found by backing out the main menu and clicking on raid mode. This arcade-style spin-off subversion completely throws off the shackles of the main story narrative ambitions, embracing a loud, addictive and thoroughly unapologetic action framework that is easily the most polished aspect of the entire package. Raid mode completely discards the concept of horror. It doesn't want you to conserve your ammunition, hide from threat or soak in the atmosphere. It wants you to run full speed through bite-sized recycled maps from Resident Evil 6 and Revelations, tearing through legions of elemental-infused enemies to chase damage numbers and loot drops. It turns the traditional mechanics of the series into an RPG-infused live service-style grinding machine, packed with unlockable characters, custom weapon slots, and skill trees to max out. It is addictive, incredibly fun, and an absolute blast to play through on a quiet weekend. But looking at it from a critical perspective, raid mode also perfectly highlights the mechanical schizophrenia holding this era together. Capcom built an entire secondary mode that is fundamentally an action-heavy, fast-paced shooter, complete with floating damage numbers and micro loops designed for high replayability, and then tried to use those exact same mechanical bones to support a slow, atmospheric-driven campaign. It is a design approach that shows a studio trying to have its cake and eat it too, crafting a split-brained experience where the arcade side content feels more confident and fully realised than the actual survival horror story it was built to supplement.
Hey,
You should have done yourself favor and died while you had chance, Kroshka.
great.
Nothing cements the feeling of this fragmented experimental era quite like the 2 bonus DLC chapters included to pad out the episodic release, The Struggle and Little Miss. If the primary campaign felt like an awkward compromise between horror and action, these extra segments are the moments Capcom decided to push the individual companion gimmicks to the absolute logical extremes, resulting in 2 wildly different experiences that feel entirely divorced from the traditional structure of the franchise. First, you have The Struggle, which follows Mora's survival during the 6-month gap before her father arrives on the island. This chapter completely strips away any remaining presence of survival horror and turns the game into an aggressive, arcade-style hunting simulator. You are literally tracking down wildlife for rations while fighting through wave after wave of aggressive combat arenas with a strict timer ticking down at the top of the screen. It is fast, loud, and incredibly frustrating, prioritising high-speed crowd control over any sense of pacing or resource management. Then the game pulls a complete U-turn with Little Miss, an extra chapter focused entirely on Natalia's journey. This segment strips away your ability to fight back altogether, forcing you into a strict, unforgiving trial and error stealth gauntlet where getting spotted by an enemy means an instant game over. You spend the entire time manipulating a split personality hallucination to scout ahead and sneak past targets in silence. They provide some decent world building for the lore obsessives, but as a piece of actual interactive entertainment, they are an exhausting reminder of a studio that was throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. They took a franchise that used to be defined by its singular, cohesive vision and broke it down into a collection of minigames and experimental prototypes, proving that by 2015, the series was completely fractured. running on the fumes of companion gimmicks rather than a true understanding of fear.
Body.
Gosh-a-rooney, you little bitch! I was supposed to win this game of tug-of-war.
By the time the final credits roll on the bonus chapters, Resident Evil Revelations 2 leaves you with a profound sense of a franchise that has completely run out of gas. It stands documented in the archive not as a structural disaster, but as a decent, harmless weekend distraction. It was a safe, mid-budget compromise that proved the old hybrid action horror formula had nothing left to give. Simply dimming the lights, leaning on nostalgia, and forcing artificial companion gimmicks wasn't enough to bring back the soul of a legendary series. But as it turns out, this middle-of-the-road experiment was the necessary final gasp of an exhausted era. It cleared the runway for Capcom to finally stop compromising, drop the chasing of generic multiplayer trends, and completely blow up the foundation to build the first-person masterpiece that was Resident Evil 7. Before the franchise could earn that legendary modern redemption arc, however, it had to endure its darkest timeline. Next time on the Retrospective, we are stepping directly into the blast radius of a title where the series didn't just stumble, it hit absolute, undeniable rock bottom. We are talking about the ultimate creative and critical bankruptcy of the 2016 tactical train wreck, Umbrella Corps. It is an entry so completely detached from the identity of the franchise that it forced the absolute radical reinvention and global overhaul of the entire series just to survive. We'll see exactly how deep the hole went before the light finally came back. If you've enjoyed tracing through the lineage of survival horror through this awkward middle era, make sure to do the classic internet inventory management, tap that like button to help the video survive the algorithm, leave a comment with your own thoughts on Barry's big return, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming autopsy of the absolute nadir of the franchise. A massive thank you goes out to the channel members. Your direct support keeps these deep dive retrospective essays viable and allows me to dissect these colossal franchise histories with the patience and depth they deserve. If you want early access to future scripts or want to support the channel further, take a look at the join button now. Until the next time, thanks for watching.